The detail that made Bundy seem harmless and fooled everyone around him. How does a monster hide in plain sight? How does a predator walk among us, shake our hands, smile at our children, and never raise a single alarm? The answer is simpler and more terrifying than you might imagine. He doesn't look like a monster at all. He looks exactly like someone you would trust. Theodore Robert Bundy was handsome. He was articulate. He was educated. He volunteered at crisis centers, worked on political campaigns, and was accepted into law school. Women found him attractive. Men found him likable. He was, by all accounts, the kind of person you would want as a neighbor, a coworker, perhaps even a friend. And that was precisely his deadliest weapon. In this investigation, we will uncover the specific detail that allowed Ted Bundy to commit some of the most heinous crimes in American history while remaining virtually invisible to those around him. We will journey through the streets of Burlington, Vermont, where his troubled story began, to Tacoma, Washington, where darkness took root, through the college campuses of Seattle, where he perfected his disguise, and finally to the courtrooms and prison cells where his mask finally crumbled. But this is more than just the story of one man's crimes. This is a story about human psychology, about our deepest vulnerabilities, and about how easily our instincts can be manipulated. Because Ted Bundy understood something fundamental about human nature. He knew that we are hardwired to help those who appear vulnerable. He knew that a charming smile and a broken arm could disarm even the most cautious person. And he exploited that knowledge with calculated precision. The question we must ask ourselves is not just how Ted Bundy fooled so many people. The question is, could he fool us today? After you hear this story, after you understand his methods and his madness, ask yourself honestly, would you have seen through his disguise? Or would you, like so many others, have stopped to help the handsome young man struggling with his books? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe you could identify someone like Ted Bundy in real life? What warning signs do you think people missed? Your perspective matters, and we want to hear from you. Now, let us begin at the beginning. In a small town where a baby boy was born into shame and secrecy, and where the seeds of a monster were quietly planted. Burlington, Vermont, in 1946 was a city still recovering from World War II. It was a place of traditional values, where family reputation meant everything and scandal was whispered about behind closed doors. Into this world, on November 24th, Theodore Robert Cowell was born at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was just 22 years old, unmarried, and facing the crushing weight of social stigma that came with bearing a child out of wedlock. The identity of Ted's father remains shrouded in mystery to this day. Eleanor claimed it was a sailor named Jack Worthington, but others suspected it might have been her own violent and abusive father. Whatever the truth, it was a secret that would haunt Ted's entire life. Eleanor's parents, deeply religious and ashamed of their daughter's situation, made a decision that would fundamentally shape the boy's psychology. They would raise Ted as their own son, and Eleanor would be introduced as his older sister. For the first 3 years of his life, Ted Bundy lived in Philadelphia with his grandparents, believing a lie that formed the foundation of his identity. His grandfather, Samuel Cowell, was a tyrannical racist who kept a large collection of pornography and was known for violent outbursts. His grandmother, Louise, suffered from depression so severe she received electroshock therapy. This was the toxic environment where Ted's earliest memories were formed. Even as a toddler, disturbing signs emerged. One morning, when Ted was just 3 years old, his aunt woke up to find herself surrounded by kitchen knives. The little boy had carefully arranged them around her sleeping body, then stood watching her with an inexplicable smile. When she asked him what he was doing, he simply giggled. The incident was dismissed as childish curiosity. In hindsight, it was a chilling preview of what was to come. In 1950, Eleanor made a bold decision. She took her young son and moved across the country to Tacoma, Washington, seeking a fresh start far from the judgment and lies of Philadelphia. Tacoma, nestled between the gray waters of Puget Sound and the shadow of Mount Rainier, offered the promise of anonymity and reinvention. The city's economy revolved around lumber mills and shipyards, where working-class families could build modest but honest lives. Shortly after arriving in Tacoma, Eleanor met Johnny Culpepper Bundy, a hospital cook who worked long hours for modest wages. He was a kind, quiet man who genuinely cared for Eleanor and was willing to accept her son as his own. They married, and Theodore Cowell became Theodore Bundy. Johnny legally adopted the boy, giving him a name and legitimacy. But Ted never accepted this gift with gratitude. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Tacoma, Ted felt the sting of being different. While Johnny worked hard to provide for the growing family, Ted resented his stepfather's lack of education and sophistication. He was embarrassed by Johnny's simple manner and blue-collar job. Ted wanted more. He wanted prestige, wealth, and status. He wanted to be someone important, someone who commanded respect and admiration. The gap between what he desired and what his family could provide created a festering anger that never truly healed. Ted's childhood in Tacoma appeared normal on the surface. He attended Woodrow Wilson High School, where he was a decent student but struggled to fit in socially. He was shy, awkward with girls, and felt like an outsider looking in at the popular kids who seemed to have everything come so easily. But beneath this unremarkable exterior, darkness was growing. As a teenager, Ted began engaging in increasingly disturbing behaviors. He would roam neighborhoods at night, peering through windows to watch women undress. He shoplifted for the thrill of it, not because he needed the items. He consumed pornography voraciously, gravitating toward increasingly violent content. He later admitted that these images fueled fantasies that became more elaborate and more violent as the years passed. Yet to his neighbors, teachers, and family, Ted seemed like a perfectly normal boy. He worked paper routes, mowed lawns, and smiled politely when spoken to. This ability to present one face to the world while nurturing something entirely different inside became Ted Bundy's defining characteristic. The mask was forming, carefully crafted to hide what was beneath. One crucial element of Ted's psychology emerged during these years: a profound need for control and validation. He craved recognition but felt perpetually overlooked. He desired women but felt rejected and inadequate. These feelings of powerlessness would eventually manifest in the most horrific ways imaginable. But in the 1960s, in the rain-soaked streets of Tacoma, Ted Bundy was still just a troubled teenager whom no one thought twice about. When Ted graduated from high school in 1965, he received a scholarship to attend the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma. It seemed like the beginning of a success story. The working-class boy making good, pursuing higher education, building a better life. But for Ted Bundy, college was not about education. It was about transformation. It was about becoming the person he had always wanted to be, no matter what it took. The boy who left Tacoma for university was already broken. But the mask he wore was so convincing that no one suspected just how deep that brokenness ran. And as he stepped onto campus for the first time, filled with ambition and barely contained rage, the stage was set for one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. The University of Puget Sound sprawls across a tree-lined campus in Tacoma, its Gothic revival architecture giving it an air of tradition and prestige. When Ted Bundy enrolled in 1965, he was determined to reinvent himself. Gone was the shy, awkward teenager. In his place emerged a young man who studied how successful people behaved, how they talked, how they carried themselves. Ted Bundy was not becoming himself. He was constructing a persona, carefully designed to win admiration and trust. After 1 year at Puget Sound, Ted transferred to the University of Washington in Seattle, pursuing a degree in Chinese. Seattle in the late 1960s was a city in transition. The Space Needle stood as a symbol of modernism and progress, while beneath the surface, the counterculture movement was taking root. College campuses buzzed with political activism, free love, and a sense that the old rules no longer applied. For Ted, it was the perfect environment to experiment with his new identity. It was at the University of Washington that Ted met the woman who would become his obsession and, according to many criminal psychologists, the catalyst for his murderous rampage. Her name was Stephanie Brooks, though some accounts refer to her as Diane Edwards. She came from a wealthy California family, drove a nice car, wore expensive clothes, and embodied everything Ted aspired to be. She was sophisticated, cultured, and confident in a way that both attracted and intimidated him. Ted pursued Stephanie relentlessly. He adapted his personality to match her interests, agreeing with her opinions, molding himself into what he thought she wanted. For a time, they dated seriously. Ted believed he had finally achieved what he had always craved: acceptance into a world of privilege and refinement. He was dating a woman from a wealthy family, and through her, he glimpsed the life he felt he deserved. But Stephanie saw through the performance. She recognized that beneath Ted's charm was an immature, directionless young man without real ambition or substance. In 1968, she broke up with him, telling him he needed to grow up and figure out who he really was. For Ted Bundy, this rejection was devastating. It confirmed his deepest fears about himself, that he was not good enough, that he would never truly belong in the world he desired. The breakup sent Ted into a spiral. He dropped out of the University of Washington and spent months drifting aimlessly. During this period, he traveled around the country, working odd jobs and searching for some sense of purpose. It was also during this time investigators later speculated that Ted may have discovered the truth about his parentage. Some accounts suggest he found his birth certificate and learned that the woman he thought was his sister was actually his mother, and that he had been born illegitimately in a home for unwed mothers. Whether this revelation occurred then or earlier remains disputed, but its impact on Ted's psychology cannot be overstated. His entire identity had been built on a lie. The shame his family had tried to hide became his shame. The rejection by society that his mother had experienced became his rejection. Every relationship in his life, from his earliest days, had been fundamentally dishonest. This realization, combined with Stephanie's rejection, created a toxic mixture of rage, humiliation, and a desperate need to prove his worth. But Ted Bundy did not collapse. Instead, he transformed. When he returned to the University of Washington in 1970, he was a different person. He re-enrolled as a psychology major and threw himself into his studies with unexpected intensity. He became active in Republican politics, volunteering for campaigns and attending events. He worked at a crisis hotline alongside a crime writer named Enrule, who would later become famous for writing The Stranger Beside Me, a book about working with Ted without knowing he was a serial killer. During this period, Ted was courteous, helpful, and seemingly dedicated to helping others. Enrule remembered him as one of the most caring volunteers at the crisis center, someone who genuinely seemed to understand people in distress. He saved lives during his shifts, talking people down from suicide, offering compassion and understanding. The irony of a man who would go on to murder dozens of women spending his evenings preventing suicides was lost on everyone at the time. Ted also began dating a woman named Elizabeth Klopfer, a divorced mother who worked as a secretary. Unlike Stephanie, Liz was down-to-earth, practical, and genuinely in love with Ted. She saw him as ambitious, caring, and attentive. He talked about attending law school, about building a future together. Liz had no idea that Ted was using their relationship as part of his elaborate disguise, a way to appear normal and settled while something much darker was brewing beneath the surface. In 1973, Ted was accepted into the University of Utah College of Law. It was a significant achievement, proof that he could succeed in the world that had once rejected him. But more importantly, law school would give him knowledge he would later use to devastating effect: an understanding of legal procedures, police investigations, and how the criminal justice system worked. Ted Bundy was not just becoming educated. He was preparing. During the same period, Ted did something that shocked everyone who knew him. He rekindled his relationship with Stephanie Brooks. He wrote to her, telling her about his acceptance to law school, about his political connections, about the person he had become. Stephanie, impressed by his apparent transformation, agreed to see him again. They began dating seriously, and Ted seemed devoted to her. He talked about marriage. He made plans for their future. Then, abruptly and without explanation, Ted broke up with Stephanie. He simply stopped calling, stopped writing, and cut her out of his life completely. When she finally reached him and asked what happened, Ted coldly told her that he had never loved her, that the whole thing had been a game to prove he could have her if he wanted. It was pure revenge, a calculated move to hurt her the way she had hurt him years earlier. For Ted, it was about power and control, about proving he was not the inadequate person she had once rejected. This incident reveals something crucial about Ted Bundy's psychology. He was not driven by passion or emotion. He was driven by a cold, calculating need to dominate and control. He did not want love. He wanted power. And if he could orchestrate an elaborate, years-long scheme just to hurt one woman emotionally, what was he capable of doing to strangers? By early 1974, all the pieces were in place. Ted had the education, the charm, the knowledge of psychology and law, and most importantly, he had refined his mask to perfection. He looked trustworthy. He sounded educated. He presented himself as someone respectable, someone safe. And he had developed an elaborate fantasy life centered on violence against women, fueled by years of pornography consumption and a deep-seated rage against those he felt had wronged him. But Ted needed one more element to transform from fantasist to killer. He needed a method, a way to approach victims that would bypass their natural defenses. He needed something that would make even the most cautious young woman stop and help him. And in his twisted genius, he found it. He would not approach women as a threat. He would approach them as someone who needed to be saved. He gathered his props: a fake cast for his arm, crutches, a leg brace. He bought a Volkswagen Beetle, a car so innocuous and unthreatening that it became synonymous with his crimes. And he began hunting. The first confirmed victim was Linda and Healy, a 21-year-old psychology major at the University of Washington. She disappeared from her basement apartment on February 1st, 1974. Her bed showed signs of violence, but there was no body, no clear evidence of what had happened. She simply vanished. Over the next several months, young women began disappearing from college campuses across Washington state at an alarming rate. Donna Gale Manson, Susan Rancourt, Roberta Parks, Brenda Ball, Georgianne Hawkins. All were college-aged, attractive, with long dark hair parted in the middle, resembling Stephanie Brooks. All disappeared without a trace, leaving behind terrified families and baffled investigators who could find no connection between the cases. The mask Ted Bundy had spent years constructing was working perfectly, and as the body count rose, he remained invisible, hiding in plain sight, trusted and admired by everyone around him. The perfect predator had been built, and now he was hunting. We have journeyed through Ted Bundy's transformation from a troubled boy in Tacoma to a calculated predator stalking the campuses of Washington state. We have seen how rejection, shame, and a desperate need for control shaped him into something monstrous. But we have only begun to understand his most dangerous weapon, his ability to seem harmless. What do you think about what you have heard so far? Did Ted Bundy's background make his crimes inevitable? Or were there moments where he could have chosen a different path? Leave your thoughts in the comments. We want to know what you are thinking as this story unfolds. The Pacific Northwest in the summer of 1974 was a place of extraordinary natural beauty and growing terror. From the misty shores of Puget Sound to the dense forests of the Cascade Mountains, young women were vanishing. Police departments across Washington and Oregon were receiving missing person reports at an unprecedented rate, but they struggled to find any connection between the cases. The victims came from different cities, attended different schools, and had no apparent connection to each other. It seemed random, impossible to predict or prevent. But there was a pattern, and it centered around one specific detail that would eventually become Ted Bundy's signature: his exploitation of human compassion through feigned vulnerability. On July 14, 1974, a sunny Sunday afternoon at Lake Sammamish State Park near Seattle, multiple witnesses saw something that would later prove crucial to the investigation. A handsome young man with his arm in a sling was approaching women at the crowded beach, asking for help loading a sailboat onto his car. His name, he said, was Ted. He was polite, well-spoken, and seemed genuinely helpless with his injured arm. Several women declined, sensing something was not quite right despite his charming demeanor. But two young women, Janice Ott and Denise Naslund, agreed to help the friendly stranger. They were never seen alive again. Their bodies were discovered months later in a remote area, reduced to skeletal remains that told a horrific story of violence and murder. But the witnesses who saw them leave with Ted provided police with the first real description of the suspect. A handsome man, about 5'10", driving a Volkswagen Beetle with his arm in a sling and introducing himself as Ted. This was the detail that made Ted Bundy so devastatingly effective. His understanding that vulnerability disarms suspicion. Think about the psychology at work here. When we see someone who appears injured or disabled, our natural instinct is to help. We do not view them as a threat. We view them as someone who needs our compassion. Ted Bundy understood this instinct and weaponized it with chilling calculation. The injured arm, the crutches, the leg brace. These were not signs of actual disability. They were props in an elaborate performance designed to bypass our natural defenses. A woman walking alone might be cautious of a stranger approaching her. But a stranger who appears to be struggling with crutches and asking for help carrying books to his car? That triggers a completely different response. It triggers our desire to be helpful, kind, and compassionate. And that momentary lowering of guard was all Ted needed. His physical appearance enhanced the effectiveness of this disguise. Ted Bundy was conventionally attractive by the standards of the 1970s. He had thick brown hair, striking eyes, and a smile that people described as charismatic. He dressed neatly, usually in button-down shirts and khaki pants, projecting an image of a responsible college student or young professional. He did not look like the popular image of a criminal. He looked like someone you would trust to watch your dog or help you move furniture. But appearance alone was not enough. Ted was also remarkably articulate and intelligent. When he spoke to potential victims, he came across as educated, friendly, and harmless. He would make small talk about the weather, about classes, about anything that would establish a connection and normalize the interaction. By the time he asked for help, he had already established himself as a safe, trustworthy person. The request for assistance seemed perfectly reasonable, not like the trap it actually was. Ted varied his approaches based on location and circumstance. Sometimes he wore a fake cast on his arm. Other times he used crutches. Sometimes he pretended to be a police officer, complete with a badge he had manufactured. He would approach women in parking lots, at bus stops, near their apartments, always in locations where his request for help seemed plausible and where witnesses might be present but not too close. The presence of other people nearby actually enhanced the deception, making his victims feel safer about helping him. Criminal psychologists who later studied Bundy's methods were struck by their sophistication. He did not rely on physical, overpowering strength or weapons to initially control his victims. Instead, he used social engineering, exploiting cultural expectations about politeness, helpfulness, and trust. Young women in the 1970s were taught to be courteous, to help those in need, to not be rude or suspicious. Ted Bundy turned those cultural values into a weapon. Consider the position his victims were in. A well-dressed, attractive young man with an injured arm asks for help carrying something to his car. What reason would they have to refuse? To say no would seem unkind, even paranoid. And if they did feel a twinge of unease, they could rationalize it away. After all, he is injured. He is asking for help in a public place. He seems nice. Other people are around. What harm could there be in walking to a parking lot to help someone for just a minute? But once a victim was isolated, even briefly, the mask came off. Ted was physically strong despite his average build, and he was prepared with weapons and restraints hidden in his car. The friendly college student transformed into a predator in seconds. The transition was so sudden and shocking that victims often could not process what was happening until it was too late. Between 1974 and 1975, at least 9 young women disappeared from Washington and Oregon, and these are only the cases where Bundy's involvement has been confirmed. Investigators now believe the actual number may be much higher, possibly including victims in California, Idaho, and other states where Bundy lived or traveled during this period. Each disappearance followed the same general pattern. An attractive young woman with long dark hair, approached in a public place by a charming man who needed help, last seen walking toward a Volkswagen Beetle, then never seen alive again. Despite the pattern, catching Ted proved extraordinarily difficult. He was careful about forensic evidence, disposing of bodies in remote locations where they might not be found for months or even years. By the time remains were discovered, weather and wildlife had destroyed most physical evidence. He crossed jurisdictional boundaries, committing crimes in different counties and states, making it difficult for law enforcement agencies to connect the cases and coordinate their investigations. And crucially, he did not match the profile that investigators were looking for. In the 1970s, the public image of a serial killer was someone who looked dangerous, who had an obvious criminal history, who fit the stereotype of a deviant outsider. Ted Bundy shattered that stereotype. He was a law student. He worked in politics. He volunteered at crisis centers. When Elizabeth Klopfer, his girlfriend, saw the composite sketch released by police and heard the description of a man named Ted driving a Volkswagen Beetle, she recognized her boyfriend. But she struggled to reconcile the man she knew, the man she loved, with the monster described in the news reports. Elizabeth eventually called the police to report her suspicions, but she was just one of thousands of tips pouring in. Ted was also reported by a friend from the crisis center and by a former girlfriend. But each time investigators looked into Ted Bundy, they saw an educated, articulate young man with no criminal record, studying law, with character references from respected members of the community. He did not fit their profile. He seemed harmless. This was Ted Bundy's genius and his most terrifying legacy. He proved that monsters do not always look like monsters. They can look like the person sitting next to you in class, serving you coffee, or asking for directions. The detail that made him seem harmless, his carefully constructed mask of normalcy and vulnerability, was the very thing that made him so dangerous. On December 30th, 1977, Ted executed his second and more successful escape. Over weeks, he had stolen tools and gradually sawed through the metal grill in his cell ceiling. He had also lost a significant amount of weight to fit through the small opening. When guards failed to conduct a routine head count, Ted climbed through the ceiling, made his way through the crawl space, and emerged in the apartment of a jailer who was away for the evening. He changed into civilian clothes left in the apartment, walked out the front door, and disappeared into the night. This time, Ted remained free for much longer. And he used that freedom to kill again, this time with even more brutality than before. He traveled to Tallahassee, Florida, enrolled in Florida State University under a false name, and blended into the college community. But his need to kill had become insatiable. On January 15, 1978, in the early morning hours, Ted entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University through a rear door that had been left unlocked. What happened over the next 15 minutes was one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history. Moving from room to room, Ted attacked 4 young women as they slept, beating them with a piece of firewood. Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy were killed. Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner were severely injured but survived. The brutality of the Chi Omega attacks was different from his previous crimes. This was not the calculated, controlled predator who used charm and deception. This was a man in a frenzy, attacking indiscriminately, taking enormous risks. The mask had completely slipped. The monster was fully revealed. Less than an hour after the Chi Omega attacks, Ted attacked another woman, Cheryl Thomas, in her apartment 8 blocks away. She survived with severe injuries and permanent disabilities. And then, on February 9th, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach disappeared from her junior high school in Lake City, Florida. Her body was found weeks later, showing signs of sexual assault and murder. But Ted's luck was finally running out. His car, a stolen vehicle, was spotted by a police officer in Pensacola on February 15th. When the officer ran the plates and discovered the car was stolen, he attempted to pull Ted over. Another chase ensued, this time ending with Ted being wrestled to the ground and arrested. As he was placed in handcuffs, Ted reportedly said, "I wish you had killed me. This time there would be no escape." Florida had strong forensic evidence. Bite marks on Lisa Levy's body that matched Ted's teeth with stunning precision, eyewitness testimony placing him in Tallahassee, and fibers linking him to the crime scenes. More importantly, Florida had the death penalty, and prosecutors were determined to use it. The trials that followed were media spectacles unlike anything America had seen before. They were among the first trials to be nationally televised, and millions of Americans watched as Ted Bundy defended himself in court once again. He was polished, confident, even flirtatious with the female judge. At one point, while questioning Carol Boone on the witness stand, he asked her to marry him. She said yes. Under Florida law, because they declared their intention in front of a judge, they were legally married. The surreal nature of the trial, with a serial killer marrying a woman while on trial for multiple murders, only added to the public fascination. Women continued to write love letters to Ted. Some appeared at the trial wearing their hair like his victims, perhaps unconsciously hoping to catch his attention. The disconnect between what Ted Bundy had done and how people perceived him remained absolute. On July 24, 1979, Ted Bundy was convicted of the Chi Omega murders. During the penalty phase, the judge, who had actually complimented Ted's legal skills earlier, sentenced him to death. "Take care of yourself, young man," the judge said. "It's a tragedy to this court to see such a total waste of humanity. You are a bright young man. You would have made a good lawyer. But you went the wrong way, partner." Ted showed no emotion. He was later convicted of Kimberly Leach's murder and received a second death sentence. And so Ted Bundy, the man who had fooled so many people for so long, finally sat on death row, his mask shattered, his true nature revealed. But even then, he was not finished playing games. He would spend the next decade manipulating the system, granting interviews, and dangling the possibility of confessing to more murders in exchange for delays in his execution. The cat and mouse game had finally ended. The cat had been caught, but the question remained: how many mice had he caught before his capture? And what did his reign of terror teach us about the monsters that hide behind charming smiles? Florida State Prison, Stark, Florida. Death row. This is where Ted Bundy spent his final years, housed in a small concrete cell, no longer the charming law student or the handsome predator stalking college campuses. He was inmate number 07077, waiting for his appointment with Old Sparky, Florida's electric chair. But even on death row, Ted Bundy could not stop playing his games. He understood that he possessed something valuable: knowledge. He knew where bodies were buried. He knew details of unsolved crimes. And he was willing to trade that information for the one thing he desperately wanted: more time. Like a man at the end of a poker game, he doled out his confessions slowly, strategically, always trying to extend his life just a little bit longer. In 1984, Ted began working with FBI agents Robert Ressler and Bill Hagmaier, helping them develop profiles for other serial killers still at large. The most notable case was the Green River Killer, who was actively murdering women in the Seattle area. Ted provided insights into how serial killers select victims, dispose of bodies, and evade capture. His information was disturbingly accurate, based not on theory but on personal experience. He was, in effect, consulting on himself. Serial killers are not monsters, Ted told the FBI agents. They are men, and that is what makes them so dangerous. If they looked like monsters, people would avoid them, but they look normal. They can be your neighbor, your coworker, your friend. They blend in because they have learned to mimic normal human behavior, even if they do not truly feel it. These interviews were chilling not just for what Ted revealed about his crimes, but for what they revealed about his complete lack of genuine remorse. He spoke about his victims clinically, as though discussing characters in a story rather than real women whose lives he had destroyed. He used passive language, saying things like, "the body was disposed of," rather than, "I killed her and dumped her body." Even in confession, he tried to distance himself from his actions. As his execution date approached, Ted suddenly became more talkative. In a series of interviews in January 1989, just days before his scheduled execution, he confessed to 30 murders. But investigators believed the true number was much higher, possibly exceeding 100. Ted admitted to crimes in Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, and Florida, but he also hinted at victims in California, Idaho, Pennsylvania, and Vermont. Some of these confessions could be verified. Others could not. Ted seemed to enjoy the attention, the power of having information that everyone wanted. In one particularly disturbing interview, Ted discussed his use of vulnerability as a disguise. "People want to help," he explained. It's a natural instinct, especially for women who have been socialized to be nurturing and kind. If you approach someone as a threat, they will run. But if you approach them as someone who needs help, someone who is vulnerable, they will come to you. They will lower their guard. And that is when you have them. He described in detail how he would practice his approach, rehearsing his lines like an actor preparing for a role. He would manufacture reasons why he needed help that seemed plausible and innocuous. A broken arm made it difficult to carry books. Crutches made it hard to load a sailboat. These were problems that any kind person would naturally want to solve. And once the victim was close enough, isolated enough, the performance ended and the reality began. Ted also blamed his crimes on pornography, claiming in a final interview with Christian evangelist James Dobson that violent pornography had twisted his mind and led him to commit murder. Many viewed this as a final manipulation, an attempt to shift responsibility from himself to external influences, to garner sympathy even at the very end. Criminal psychologists noted that millions of people consume pornography without becoming murderers, and that Ted's explanation conveniently ignored his own choices and agency. On January 24, 1989, at 7:06 in the morning, Theodore Robert Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. He was 42 years old. Outside the prison, a crowd had gathered, some holding signs that read, "Burn, Bundy, burn," and Tuesday is Friday. When news of his death was announced, cheers erupted. It was a grim celebration, but for many of the victims' families, it represented a measure of justice finally served. Ted's last words were to his attorney, "Jim, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." There was no apology to his victims' families, no final confession of all his crimes, no genuine acceptance of responsibility. Even at the moment of death, Ted Bundy remained focused on himself, on his needs, on his narrative. But the story does not end with his execution. Ted Bundy's legacy lives on in ways both helpful and troubling. On the positive side, his case revolutionized criminal profiling and investigation techniques. The FBI's behavioral science unit used information from Ted and other serial killers to develop the psychological profiles that are now standard in law enforcement. His case taught investigators that serial killers do not fit one stereotype, that they can be educated, attractive, and socially adept. His case also changed how missing person investigations are conducted. The disappearances in Washington state were initially treated as separate, unconnected incidents because they occurred in different jurisdictions. Ted's crimes demonstrated the need for better communication and coordination between law enforcement agencies. This led to the development of systems like the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, which helps connect similar crimes across jurisdictions. But Ted Bundy's legacy also has a darker side. He has become an icon of true crime culture, the subject of countless books, documentaries, movies, and podcasts. Netflix series, biographical films starring famous actors, and endless speculation about his psychology have turned Ted Bundy into a cultural phenomenon. Some argue this attention glorifies his crimes and disrespects his victims. The women he killed, Linda Healy, Donna Manson, Susan Rancourt, and dozens of others, are often reduced to statistics, while Ted himself remains the focus of fascination. There is also a troubling romanticization of Ted Bundy, particularly among young women who see his handsome face in old photographs and struggle to reconcile his appearance with his actions. Social media posts declaring him attractive, fan fiction imagining relationships with him, and a general fascination with his charisma perpetuate the very misconception that allowed him to kill: the belief that attractive, charming people cannot be dangerous. This is perhaps Ted Bundy's most enduring and dangerous legacy. He proved definitively that evil does not announce itself with obvious warning signs. It does not wear a sinister mask or speak in threatening tones. Evil can smile, can be polite, can ask for help in loading books into a car on a sunny afternoon. And it can kill without conscience or remorse. The detail that made Ted Bundy seem harmless, his carefully constructed persona of vulnerability and normalcy, was not unique to him. It is a tactic used by predators throughout history and continuing today. Child molesters often present themselves as trustworthy authority figures. Domestic abusers often seem charming and devoted during courtship. Scam artists succeed because they seem legitimate and friendly. The lesson of Ted Bundy is not just about one man's crimes. It is about the human tendency to trust appearances and to dismiss our instincts when someone seems nice. So what should we learn from the story of Ted Bundy? First, that charm is not character. Being articulate, educated, or attractive does not make someone trustworthy. Second, that vulnerability can be weaponized. Not everyone asking for help has good intentions. Third, that our instincts matter. Many of Ted's potential victims felt something was wrong but ignored that feeling because they did not want to seem rude or paranoid. Those instincts, that inner voice warning us of danger, should not be dismissed. Finally, we must remember the victims. Not just the names and ages, but the lives that were cut short. Linda Healy was studying psychology and wanted to help people. Donna Manson wrote poetry and loved nature. Susan Rancourt was planning to become a teacher. These were not just statistics or case files. They were daughters, sisters, friends. They had dreams, plans, and people who loved them. Their absence created ripples of pain that continue to this day. Ted Bundy wanted to be remembered. He wanted to be famous, to be studied, to be the subject of fascination. In that sense, he got what he wanted. But we must ensure that alongside that fascination comes understanding, not admiration. We must learn from his crimes without glorifying them. We must remember his victims without forgetting them. The handsome law student who fooled everyone, who used his charm and feigned vulnerability to commit unspeakable acts, is gone. But the lessons his crimes teach us remain urgently relevant. Because somewhere, right now, someone is perfecting their mask. Someone is learning to seem harmless while harboring dark intentions. And our best defense is knowledge, awareness, and the willingness to trust our instincts even when everything looks perfectly normal. We have journeyed through one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. From the troubled childhood in Burlington and Tacoma, through the hunting grounds of college campuses across the Pacific Northwest, to the courtrooms of Utah and Florida, and finally to the death chamber where Ted Bundy's story ended, we have explored not just the crimes of one man, but the vulnerabilities in human nature that he exploited so effectively. The question we posed at the beginning remains unanswered by each of us individually. Could Ted Bundy fool you? After learning about his methods, his psychology, and his crimes, do you believe you would recognize someone like him if you encountered them today? More importantly, what warning signs do you think people in the 1970s should have noticed? And what warning signs should we be looking for now? The uncomfortable truth is that Ted Bundy was not caught because someone saw through his disguise. He was caught because of a routine traffic stop and a vigilant police officer who noticed something suspicious. Even after his arrest, many people who knew him struggled to believe the charges. His mask was that convincing. This raises profound questions about trust, intuition, and the nature of evil itself. We want to believe that dangerous people look dangerous, that we can identify threats through obvious signs. But Ted Bundy proved that assumption wrong. The most dangerous predators are often the ones who look least dangerous. They are the ones who have mastered the art of seeming harmless. So what can we do? We can educate ourselves and others about predatory behavior. We can trust our instincts when something feels wrong, even if we cannot articulate why. We can teach young people, especially young women, that being polite is not more important than being safe, that it is acceptable to refuse requests for help if something feels off, that rudeness is better than victimhood. We can also remember that Ted Bundy's crimes were not inevitable. At multiple points, he made choices. He chose to consume violent pornography. He chose to act on his fantasies. He chose to kill again and again despite having opportunities to stop. Understanding the factors that shaped him does not excuse his actions. He was not a helpless victim of his circumstances. He was a person who made evil choices repeatedly. The victims of Ted Bundy deserve to be remembered not as footnotes in his story, but as individuals whose lives had value and meaning beyond the moment they encountered a monster. Their families still carry the pain of their loss. Some of them never received closure because Ted never confessed to all his crimes. Some bodies were never found. Some families still wait for answers that will never come. And perhaps that is the final lesson of Ted Bundy's story. Evil leaves scars that never fully heal. The damage extends far beyond the immediate victims to families, communities, and society itself. When we sensationalize criminals, when we focus more on the killer than the killed, we perpetuate that harm. We owe it to the victims to remember them as people, not just as names on a list of Ted Bundy's crimes. Now we want to hear from you. After everything you have learned about Ted Bundy, what stands out to you most? What warning signs do you believe were missed? Do you think society today is better prepared to identify predators like him? Or are we still vulnerable to the same psychological tricks he used? How do we balance awareness and caution with trust and compassion? These are not easy questions, but they are important ones. Share your thoughts, your reactions, and your opinions in the comments below. Your perspective adds to the conversation and helps all of us think more deeply about these issues. If this documentary has made you think, if it has challenged your assumptions or taught you something new, please consider subscribing to our channel and activating notifications so you never miss our future investigations into the cases that shaped history and continue to influence our world today. And before you go, make sure to watch the next recommended video, where we explore another case that will challenge everything you thought you knew about human behavior, trust, and the masks that people wear. Thank you for staying with us through this difficult but important journey. Your willingness to confront uncomfortable truths is what makes content like this meaningful. Stay safe, trust your instincts, and never forget that evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it just asks for help carrying books to a car.